Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
All right. So your paper has been accepted for the conference, and there you are, preparing your slides, or maybe sitting there in the front row thinking, my talk is coming up. So this is just a little bit about kind of what you might think about, what to put in your talk, and a bit about how to present it. So there's a little bit of overlap with what I said this morning, so I'm going to go quickly through that, but there's quite a lot that isn't as well. The good news here is that quite a lot of talks are not so great. So there's plenty of opportunity for you to shine like a star in the firmament so that out of the morning's talk, yours is the one that everybody remembers. Wouldn't that be good? Right? And it's also worth remembering, when I was telling about those referees who are doing you the service of giving you their time, every time you give a talk, there's an audience of 5 or 50 people who are giving you, again, their most priceless commodity, their attention. So, make good use of it. And when I say make good use of it, excuse me, don't use it to try to impress your audience, right? They have better things to do with their lives than be impressed by you. As I say, they're not particularly interested in you personally at all. Nor can you tell them everything you know about this topic. They don't want to know everything you know about the topic, nor can you tell them all the technical details. What do they want to know from this morning? The idea. Good. You've got the idea. Yes. So, what you want them to walk away with is, if not all the gory details of your idea, you'd like everybody to leave with a kind of intuitive insight into the idea that you have given them. And in fact, you'd like to sort of engage and excite and provoke them so much that they're kind of, they're foaming with eagerness. They can't wait to get their hands on the paper to get the details. Right? You've got to, so that's your goal, to get them hooked. And making them glad making them glad they came is kind of important criterion. Right? If they're glad they came to your talk, they'll come to the next one. They'll go read your paper. Now, but of course, it's not all that easy to do that with an audience. And this is the audience that it might be easy to do that with, right? This is the audience that read all your previous papers. They came to the conference specifically to hear you speak, right? And they know all about the technical background that you're about to present. So they're kind of poised, right? Ready to hear all that you have to say for them. Also, they're alert, it's 10 o'clock in the morning, they've been for their morning run, and the gym, they sat in the jacuzzi, now they're ready. But actually, this is the audience that you actually get. They've never heard of you, they don't know the technical background, and they're sleepy. So what's your goal? Your goal is to wake them up, right? Your goal is to make them unable to read their email on their laptops, because what is going on at the front is so exciting and engaging, right? You have a very short time to do that in, right? You've got to kind of hook them up in the first first 2 minutes, right? At the beginning, you've got, of a technical talk anyway, you have a kind of couple of minutes which people will give you a bit of grace. They'll pay attention to you for a little while, and then they'll start to read their email, right? This didn't used to be a problem before wireless networks, but now it's a big problem, right? So you've got that 2 minutes to get them hooked. So what are you to say in your talk? Well, so this bit is about what to put in your talk. The things that I'll put in is, well, you want to get to your key idea. That's the main thing you're after. But you have to give them some motivation to begin with. So you want to start with a bit of motivation and then lead up quickly to your key idea. And really, there's nothing else you've got to do. Talks typically, I don't know, some 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour. If you get a full departmental seminar, an hour. So then you have room for some more technical detail. But anything up to half an hour, you don't really have time to do more than just these two things. Right? There it is. You have to prune rather ruthlessly. Right? So in the motivation part, you want to try to articulate what the problem you're trying to solve, why it's an interesting problem, and something about why it's an unsolved problem, right? And why it would be worthwhile to be able to solve it. So here's a kind of example, a couple of examples, right? Java class files are large, they get sent over the network. Can we use language-aware data compression? So you're saying, well, maybe rather than using generic data compression algorithms, perhaps I could use something that knows that it's compressing Java, and perhaps I could do a much better job. Oh, and by the way, I have managed to do a much better job. I get a 50% better result than the best generic zipping technology. So in those, in that 20 seconds, you've managed to get a quick idea of the basic idea, something to do with language-specific compression, a quick idea that it worked well, and a vague idea of the motivation. Well, I've got this network in the way. Do you see the kind of thing that I mean? And you've got to think, can I do that in 2 minutes? The 2 minutes that I had before they go back to their email. Okay? It's not easy to achieve this, I grant you, but that's your goal. Okay, so that's sort of the motivation bit, right? Then for the key idea bit, it's very much the same as in a paper. You must know what your key idea is. You have got to ruthlessly prune your talk so that you trim away everything that is not contributing to that key idea. And you need to be specific about what the key idea is, right? So when you get to the slide that says, here's the moment, you've got to jump up and down and say, if you remember no other slide, this is the one. This is the moment at which I'm telling you the bit that you want to be. Even if they're reading their mail, they'll wake up at that point, right? So so don't leave them in any doubt. Stand on the table or something to say this is the slide. Don't forget this one, right? Right. Now, there's a trade-off in talks, right? That sometimes you think, well, the audience don't know in any great detail about my technical area, so maybe I should be broad and shallow. I should say a little about quite a lot of things. But I find those sort of talks very unsatisfying because they say a little bit about stuff and I haven't understood any particular thing in any depth. I prefer talks that have some meat, right? Some sort of vegetarians, some red meat, right? And that means you may have to do a little bit of this sort of context-setting stuff. What is the problem? What is the general area I'm working with? But sort of zoom in pretty quickly. You can say I'm zooming in. You can say I'm just going to study one particular sub-problem here and try to take you through that. And then at the end you can then say, actually the paper doesn't just deal with that narrow sub-problem. It deals with this and this. But of course it doesn't deal with that and that. So you can, by the end of the talk, you may be able to broaden out a bit again. But I think it's helpful to even if it means leaving out half your paper, right? To carry out something in enough detail that your audience can come with you on some just carry the intuition through for an example. You see what I mean? So the general picture here is go deep, but go deep in enough detail that you can be followed, not just go deep and become highly technical so that nobody can understand you. Okay? That's my idea here. And of course, if you're going to go deep, are you just going to provide lots of fancy theorems? No, of course you're not. You're going to primarily do this by showing examples. And I've stressed this repeatedly, so I won't stress it anymore now, except to say that in a talk, right, you may never get to the general case. In the paper, you probably could. A paper that consists only of 2 or 3 examples and a claim that you have a general solution won't get accepted. A talk that gives 2 or 3 general examples and says, go read the paper for the general case, that's okay. It's quite nice if you can give some indication of how the generality works out, but even that is not essential. You just have to give a sense of how you went about it, a sense of why your solution works, and then they'll go and read the paper. Does that make sense? Sometimes examples are also good, not just to convey the intuition, but also to show where the corner cases are. You can have sort of weird examples that say, here's something you might not really do this, but it shows where when my system breaks or somebody else's system breaks. But little examples, even if they're contrived, can serve to illustrate corner cases in a way that a general theorem just doesn't. So here's an example from a talk that I gave a few years ago. So here's the general statement. This is about exception handling in a lazy functional language, right? So what do exceptions mean in a lazy language? So I started off with a very brief general statement. Usually in an imperative language, you think of exceptions as being to do with control flow. You throw an exception and you peel off stack frames until you get to a catch frame, right? It's rather a control flow kind of operation. In a lazy functional language, we don't really have control flow in the same way. So what are we to do? Answer, we won't do that at all. We'll express exceptions in the form of data. Right? So rather than a function throwing an exception, it returns a data value. Here's a data type declaration that says either either a value of type maybe A is nothing, or it's just carrying a value. And the lookup function, instead of throwing an exception if the address isn't in the dictionary, returns either nothing to say it's not there, or just X to say it is there and it's called X. Right? So I haven't laid too much stress on the general stuff. I've immediately illustrated it with an example. And then you can go back to the generality. Does that make sense as a general plan? And notice here, I probably wouldn't even say this in a talk. This is to do with related work. I might give a citation on the slide that makes the point that this particular bit is derived directly from somebody else's work. And so again, you're just, as it were, giving a nod to somebody else saying, cool work that, haven't got time to even vocalize it, but there it is. And go read the paper, you'll find more details. See the point? Okay? Any observations so far? That's all about what to put in. In some ways, the bits to put in are the easy bits, is what to leave out that's a bit harder. So far, so good? All right. What about what to leave out? Here is my first candidate for what to leave out. The outline. Right? How many talks have you seen that start like this? And they give you a list of things. And often, particularly with, some speakers will then put up a slide like this and will then spend 3 or 4 minutes on it. They'll sort of read out the titles and say, but for each one, they'll say a little bit about it. And remember, at this stage, this is the moment, this is that vital 2 minutes in which the audience is paying attention, and you give them a kind of chapter of contents for your talk in which you say a little bit about each that nobody can understand because they haven't heard the talk yet. Right? So it's almost self-defeating. You're using your golden moments for something that is hard to understand. So it can be useful to have signposts during a talk. So that's what I was doing here, right? I was just giving a little signpost that said end of one section, beginning of another. And sometimes people then put up a little sort of contents list on the signpost slide that says kind of where you've got to. But putting this up at the beginning, particularly and then speaking to it, is a disaster. Putting it up at the beginning for 10 seconds, just about maybe, but barely worth it. Right? But definitely don't speak to this at any length. Does that make sense? And you can think of your own experience in listening to other people's talks and whether you found this title slide, this sort of structure slide helpful. Yeah.
Put it on top like this breadcrumbs.
Oh yeah, sometimes people have at the top of the slide, some of these slide preparing software have a kind of the contents at the top with a highlighted one where you are. That if it's sort of not too obtrusive, that's just fine. But don't put numbers on your slides, right? At least don't put numbers on your slides that say, you know the ones that say 8 out of 63, right? And the audience is thinking, 8 out of 63, half an hour gone, right? 56 slides to go. That's taking us until dinner time, right? And they become fixated on it. They look, 8 out of 63. Oh, we're up to 12 out of 63. It's a huge distraction, right? So the number is not so bad. The number can be quite useful, but then an audience can say, could you go back to slide 12? They might remember a question attached to a slide number. But do not put the total. And that's the only disadvantage of the breadcrumb things, is that you can see how long we've still got to go before we get to have our lunch. But it's not as bad as the numbers. The numbers are terrible. And I did once see somebody who had a counter, a timer, on the thing at the bottom. It said how long they'd been speaking for. And the audience just looked at at this part. They paid no further attention to, I don't know what happens. Moving pictures, it grabs people. Anyway, don't do that. All right. So don't put up an outline. But do give signposts. Right? So it's fine to do an outline that you briefly flash up between things, perhaps with a highlighted thing about the next section or the big picture like I had. That's good. That orients people. That gives them a chance to say, oh, I wanted to ask a question, but I was waiting to see whether he'd say something about it, and he didn't. So now's my chance to ask. Do you see what I mean? So that's another good reason for signposting, but not a big thing. Okay? Right. Related work. Similar to papers, but even more so, right? You do not want to have and this is not such a prevalent, it's not such a common problem as the title slide thing. People do occasionally spend a chunk of time in a talk talking about related work. It's ghastly at the beginning. It's not so great even at the end, because remember, your audience is a broader one that will have read your paper, and they're really not interested in a discussion of related work at that stage, which is not to say that you can get away without knowing the related work. Firstly, it must be in your paper, as we discussed this morning. Secondly, it's worth citing sort of just in a tiny bit of soundtrack or in the corner of your slide if it's particularly relevant to a slide. And if somebody asks a question, you must know the related work and say, absolutely. Yes, Wadler did that in 1980. We are indeed building on that. The paper discusses that. So, there's no excuse for not knowing or not giving credit to people. It's just that you don't want to spend, when you only have 25 minutes in front of an audience, you do not want to spend 5 of it listing related work unless that contributes in the critical evaluation sense you were describing earlier, unless it contributes to an understanding of the idea. Okay? Yeah.
So sometimes there are really famous and obvious solutions to some problems, right? And if you don't tell that, maybe just even in one slide, then people keep thinking about, this guy doesn't know.
Yeah, exactly.
And the question answer session is all about that.
Yeah.
And you could probably get away with it.
No, you're quite right. So when there is a kind of obvious solution, it's rather like we were saying this morning. If there's an obvious dead end, if there's an obvious path that turns out to be or just turns out to be different, right, then it's certainly worth mentioning. Yeah. If you think it's going to distract my audience if I don't mention it, then say so, right? But if you're just thinking, if I'm going to do the full scholarly thing, I've got to tell them about it, don't do that. Thanks. Yeah. Okay? So, I've said this, right? Acknowledge, yes, and yes. Make them say nice things as you go along. Now, we're talking about things to leave out. The title slide, the related work section, and technical detail, right? What happens when you put up a slide like this? It's almost a physical thing. You can see the audience go, ugh, right? This is not to say you should leave all technical detail out. So quite often when there is a figure like this in my paper, I might do one of two things. I might show this slide to say, don't look at the details. I just want to show you that all the detail is in this one figure in the paper, right? It fits in one figure. That's useful information. You don't pause. Another thing I sometimes do, I take one of these rules and blow it up to full screen and say, I'm going to take you through this rule because the other ones are in the paper and you can work them out in more detail, right? But what you can't do is to put this up and kind of expect people to absorb it. They're just going to feel depressed and stupid, and you don't want your audience to feel depressed and stupid. So the difficulty here, of course, is that the technical detail is what you have worked for. Right? It feels like, if you don't present that material, it feels like you're not giving them the thing that cost you the most pain. Right? But sadly, your audience is not interested in your pain. You've got to give them the bits that they need. So, sometimes, of course, people will ask about some technical questions. So it's not a bad idea to have some specifics. I mean, a slide like this, another reason for having a slide like this sort of available, maybe even after your conclusion slide, is so that you can flick to it if somebody asks you a deeper technical question. You can say, oh yes, that's handled here. It's in the the second rule up here, and I'll just explain it to you now. That's not a bad plan. Okay? This is quite hard because because the technical detail is kind of often so important to you, but you've got to put yourself in the position of your audience. But remember the narrow but deep thing. I really think you want to present some technical detail about some narrow aspect, just not everything. If you present no technical detail, then you leave, well, at least the kind of audiences that I address, feeling unfed and unsatisfied. Like starving children who are just given the aromas of beautiful, of tasty things, but not actually given any of them. So don't do that. All right, so much about content. What to put in, what to leave out. All right, anybody got any other observations about what to put in or what to leave out? Yeah.
One thing is that it's really important to understand who is your audience, because sometimes it can be someone who's really an expert, So technical details may be more interesting for them, and sometimes it can be a general audience, like the ones sitting here. And then you want to stress more on the idea in a more abstract kind of way, and to go to the results, so something that can speak to everyone. So this is because I've been to talks where the lecturer was so specific, because he used to give lectures to experts.
Yeah.
And the audience was very general, came from different disciplines or different areas in computer science, to be exact. And no one understood what he was talking about.
Yeah.
So
yeah, you're totally right. So you cannot expect a single talk to work for every audience. In the end, you have to adjust your talk for your audience, and a talk to your own research group in your own narrow subdomain is quite a different talk than you would give to a conference audience in the general area, or still less to a general audience. You're absolutely right. No two ways about it. You just need to write a new talk. But I hope that the same general principles will apply, right, regardless of which audience. Even for your highly technical audience, you still need to give them, the narrow but deep thing. You're still limited for time. And for your general audience, even the broadest general audience, you want to give them some meat, right? It's just that the meat is less chewy. Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
What do you think about some people recently do a lot of, they have the idea of text-less slides. So you have no text.
Oh, right. Sort of a slide that just says infinity on it, and then a slide that says, one word or one picture. Yes. Personally, I don't find that a very engaging presentational style, because it's so difficult to present any technical material that way. So, for me, a talk that is a series of 12 pictures of beautiful landscapes or of strange Greek figures doesn't do it for me. I know it's a style that some people adopt, and it can be quite a nice change. But I wouldn't say that I've ever been to a talk when it really worked for me. Yeah.
I think a good balance is important, because too much text can be distracting, and you're not sure if you want to listen to the person or keep reading what is written. And I think that the balance is really important. But too much text, I don't know.
Yeah. There's no good. I mean, you'll get plenty of advice like this from your university sort of presentation guide. They'll say use a font of a big enough size. So even this, they'd probably think had too much text, right? So you definitely don't want to present the sort of very dense slides that people sometimes produce. But I think it's for me something like this is fine. But I didn't actually read out. Oh, don't read out your slides. Obviously, you want to. And sometimes I just miss out whole things. Because I think my audience is actually capable of reading quite quickly, and if it's a point that it doesn't seem, in the end, I think isn't worth vocalizing, I just let it go by. But yeah, you don't want to put too much information on one slide. You're right. That's part of the omit details part. But the too little end. Just the big picture, or the sometimes people have giant font and they can be saying virtually nothing. I think, why are you using slides at all? Okay, so I want to say a little bit about presenting, physically presenting a talk. And so, if your main weapon of the content is examples, your main weapon for presentation is enthusiasm. Right? If you go to a talk, and you sometimes do when people stand behind the lectern, they do this, so they're sort of pinned behind here. And they give the question, well, this is a very boring talk. None of you will be interested in it. I'm not very interested in it. But I suppose we've got to get through it somehow. So let's slide one. Let's see how do we go. Right? Does that make you feel excited? You have to convey such a wave of excitement about your work that you cannot, you can't imagine how anybody could not be equally fascinated. Right? You want to convey that sort of sense of powerful enthusiasm. And then, I tell you, it's kind of like, it has an effect on audiences that is like, where those pictures of sunflowers, right? Sun comes out and the sunflowers sort of follow the sun. So if you project a sense of excitement about your work, you will watch your audience's faces kind of open up like sunflowers, and they'll smile at you and they'll start nodding, and they'll, at least they'll appreciate that you care, right? They may not care, but they will like it that you care, right? And maybe even you can make them care. So I know that this is not something, this is a personality thing. I know that some people find it very difficult to project that kind of enthusiasm to other people because they're just naturally shy types. I think extrovert types have a deeply unfair advantage from a presentational point of view because they find it easier to effervesce with enthusiasm. But even if you're a sort of introverted, shy kind of person, you have to train yourself to pretend to be an extrovert, right? You've got to pretend, I mean, the thing is, you are excited about your ideas, presumably, right? Let's assume that you are, right? Then even if you're a shy person, you have to think, I'm going to pretend to be not a shy person so that I can convey the enthusiasm that's in my heart, right? Just do that. I'm sorry, I don't know any other way to say, and some people have an unfair advantage, but there you go. You've just got to do it. So here we are. Oh, and the last thing about being enthusiastic is if you are enthusiastic and you can't not sort of move around the room, and that makes it much easier. If you're pinned in one space and looking at your feet, your whole sort of body language conveys a sense of anxiety as well, and that's not good. So, if you're enthusiastic about something, you cannot not move around. It's just impossible. All right. So that's just about getting started, right? Enthusiasm. Next thing, you do need to know what your talk is going to say, and one way to know what your talk is going to say is to write it not very long before, right? I've said the night before, but that's perhaps a bit ambitious. But make sure that the night before you go right through and you're still making changes and polishing. Actually, it's rather cool sometimes as you sit in the morning's talk and somebody says something, right, you think that's quite a nice quote, or you can actually modify your slides to refer back to an earlier talk. That keeps you awake and engaged with the previous talks and don't make too much of it. Yes?
Sometimes, of course, you have to submit your slide in advance.
Oh, never do that. No, just say no. No.
That includes Microsoft.
Just say, I haven't written them yet, right? And I'm not going to, right? I mean, if you're giving the speech to the United Nations, the whole United Nations, maybe, right? But this is not a problem you're likely to have anytime soon, right? So it's resist people who try to get you to give them slides in advance, right? Say, I'll bring it on a USB stick, right? At most, and you can be doing that just before. It's very, yeah. One other thing about sort of enthusiasm presentation is not apologizing, right? Some people start their talks by saying, well, I'm not really a very clever person, and I'm only a PhD student, and I got here late, and my laptop broke, and my slides don't work, and, it's not very interesting work anyway. And, or they say something that conveys this kind of sense. They start with an apology. Now, it may be that you're indeed, that there may indeed be people in the audience who are cleverer than you. It seems entirely plausible. Indeed, it's an almost universal truth. But it doesn't help your audience to tell them that, right? They didn't give up their time to listen to you apologize. They just want to hear your idea. So cut to the chase, right? Don't apologize. Now, okay, so I call this the jelly effect because when you're sitting there waiting for your talk and the previous speaker is very capably, handling questions and seems confident and completely in control, and you're sitting there thinking, I'm not sure that I can physically stand up. I can feel that my legs are kind of rubbery, and I think if I stand up, I'm going to fall over. Have you experienced this feeling? Yes. It's quite scary, isn't it? Because you think there are 100 people or 50 people sitting in the room who are going to be looking at you, and you're going to just sort of fall over like a jelly. So it very seldom actually happens when you stand up that you do the jelly thing. But it is a very alarming feeling. But the thing to realize is that everybody feels like this. Not just PhD students. People who've been giving talks for years still feel like this, particularly with an audience that they do not know or a new setting, which will happen more often to you than to more experienced people. But believe me, even people who've been giving talks for a decade or two still feel very nervous in a new setting. I was giving a talk in Canterbury on Monday, and I felt quite nervous before. I thought I would be able to stand up, but I was anxious. Everybody is anxious, so don't worry about it, right? It's not that you're a wimp, right? Everybody feels this way. And it's actually not, in the end, typically a problem. What you've got to do is just the standing up bit's usually okay. You must, a good thing to remember is to try to script your first few lines so that that moment at which their eyes, like sort of lasers, lock onto you, right? That is the moment at which your mind can go blank. So having a script for your first few sentences is very helpful. If you must have a script for the whole talk, then you must, but I would urge you not to, right? It's much better if you can manage without a script. And if you do have a script, try not to read it very visibly. You know, try to practically memorize it, but it's much better if you don't have a script. But memorize your first sentence or two, all right? Okay? That's it. That's what you've got to do. And then when you interact with your audience, make sure that you can sort of see them and be heard. Even if you've got a microphone, speak as if you didn't. So I'm speaking to the back row mostly, and I think even if I didn't have a microphone, you could hear me. In a bigger room, that's harder. But you have to try to pitch your voice as if you did not have a microphone. Don't assume that the microphone will work. One thing about audiences too is there often will be one or two people in the audience who, for some reason, instinctively nod when they are listening. So some people will be looking at their laptops or reading their email. Quite a lot of people will be looking at you, hopefully. But some of them, like what's your name?
Juhi.
Juhi, right? So Juhi here is a great nodder, right? This is very reassuring. Because once you find a nodder in the audience, you can kind of look at her occasionally, and if she stopped nodding, you know something's gone wrong, right? She's got, right? So you know she's got lost or something. So don't be embarrassed. It's a very helpful trait, incidentally, to a speaker, and you should encourage it in yourself. You know, so that when your speaker looks around, you should sort of just give them a little thumbs up, as it were, with a nod to say, "I'm with you. I'm engaged." Right? Speakers love that. And the other good reason for looking at your audience rather than looking at the floor or your laptop is that audiences can tell whether you're engaging with them. Right? If they think you're reading your speech and you're really in your own little world, you're just acting like a sort of a CD player, they're going to not engage with you, right? If you actively engage with them, they will engage with you, right? And they'll at least listen. And so I put questions here. In conference talks, it's often difficult to take questions during the talk. But settings like this or departmental seminars, in fact, any time you can, taking questions is good during the talk. That's a sort of sense of engagement. In fact, I think I've got something about this. Yes, so when people start to ask questions during your talk, it's a kind of golden opportunity to find out, are people following it? Is it all making sense to them? And also to build a sense of rapport with the audience. So we had a little bit of trouble starting off this morning, right? When you were a bit quiet to begin with, right? Then finally, one of you was brave enough to ask a question, and since then we've had a great time. I have enjoyed myself much more since that first question, right? So, as a speaker, encourage your audience. In fact, usually, if you, unless it's prohibited by your chair, right, say to your audience, "I would love you to ask questions during the talk," right, and try to give pauses in which they can do so, right, in which we've done a little bit this time, and those pauses will be a little bit difficult. Because you say, "Has anybody got any questions?" And typically nothing happens, right? And then the urge is, I better move on. So it takes a bit of nerve to hold that silence, right? Will your nerve break before theirs does, right? So it's tough. It's got to be easier after the first one. You can plant somebody. That can be good, right? Plant somebody to ask a question, to kind of break the ice. Make it an easy one. Okay, now then. Of course, questions are a two-edged sword, because if you get a lot of questions, you get a lot of interaction, then you may not finish your talk. Is this a bad thing? Not necessarily, right? If you have a really good to and fro with an audience, not just with one person, right, but with a range of people, that suggests that something interesting is going on. It may not matter that you miss out part of your talk. That's not completely true, right? There might be the main payload. You might never get to the main payload because you're going into digression after digression about other people's work or something that wasn't really the point. So you may have to cut things off, right? It's a judgment call. But on the whole, I would urge you to err on the side of following the questions, even if it means omitting some material. Just keep track of what the core material that you really want to get over is. Yeah?
But what you're suggesting is a bit dangerous, because First of all, that really opens the door to hecklers.
Yes.
Which really, I mean, there are people that come in sometimes really with an agenda. Like they've heard about the topic and they've written a paper similar to it and they have an ego problem and then they will kind of, really openly attack you at the first chance you give them. And I mean, I've seen it happen like not just once or twice. And that's one thing. And like another thing is that it could also kind of focus your talk on kind of one or two people, and the rest you've completely lost.
Yes, right. So you got to use your judgment, right? So one thing is, it's true that hecklers of the kind you described exist, but they are, in my experience, rare. One talk in 10, one talk in 20, maybe, but certainly not one talk in 2.
No, I was saying one or two.
Occasionally, right? So it's a danger. I agree, but it's like saying, if you cross the road, you might get run over by a car, right? Do you not cross the road? No, you just cross it carefully, and you sort of accept that there is, in every activity there may be some danger, and we trade them across each other. But I think the trade is a good one here, of being open to questions. If you do get a persistent person, you have to just be brave and shut them up. You say, great questions, we'd love to talk to you afterwards, but if we carry on with this, I'm not going to get to the main point of the talk. And so I'm going to carry on now. And if they continue after that point, your chair should shut them up, right? So you start looking pointedly at your chairperson if that happens, okay? Likewise, if it's a very small number of people asking a lot of questions, you again have to say, it's been great having this discussion, but I'm afraid that we're going to get too deep into a corner. So you have to manage it. It's your talk, right? So it's your talk. But the engagement is key. So if you can broaden that to ask more. So if you're watching for somebody, keep an eye on the audience. You've got sort of somebody who's just very tentatively, you say, oh, question over there. That's good, right? So, or even, you can even ask somebody who's not moving at all. Say, did you have a question? But dangerous, but a good danger. A very good danger. Urge you not to say, somebody did this to me a week and a half ago. I asked a question, they said, no, I'm not going to answer that question. I just want to give the talk. Save it to the end. Oh, what a negative message. Terrible message to convey to your audience. Don't do that. Okay, so much about questions. A couple of quick things about actual content presentation, all very obvious. I find these little wireless presentation gizmos very helpful because they disconnect you from your technology. It's very, very useful. Obvious things like don't just approach the machine for the first time with your laptop right, in the 1 minute before your talk. So many times I've seen people sweating buckets because the projector does not work. And if only they'd come along half an hour before in the previous break or the previous day and just checked it, it would have been fine. It's very stressful if your technology does not work at the time. Test it in advance. Even then, it won't work at the time. But testing it in advance means at least you can say, I did test it, 20 minutes ago. About sort of slidey things, please don't do this. I hate this. And some people like it. But to me, it tells to me as an audience member that the speaker doesn't trust me to pay attention unless he sort of babies me along one little driblet at a time. It's less distracting for me just to see the slide. Sometimes there's a punchline, right? You want to reveal something. You want to ask a question and say, what do you think? And have a little doubt. Then you can put up the answer. That's okay. It's almost like a fresh slide. But some slideware has a default setting that says every list of things, every list of bullets will happen one at a time. Oh, I don't do that. And don't do this either. Right. It is very, very annoying. So you've got to have a very, very good reason. Like, you're trying to show a linked list algorithm and you've got arrows that are moving around. That's okay, but not just, anyway. And last thing about presenting it is you must finish on time. Right? Have you been to talks at which you're kind of getting to the end of the time and the speaker kind of thinks, firstly they start to speed up because the chairs, and then finally, this doesn't happen so much in conferences, but departmental talks, they said, actually, I've just got another 5 slides. Would that be okay? And they look at the program chair, and the audience is going, I've got to go, right? and the chair is sort of pinned between the audience who wants to leave and the speaker. And so he says, Yeah, of course, we'd love that. And so then you get another 15 minutes. It's a disaster, right? Because you've lost your audience by then. Somehow, audiences psychologically expect, they have a setup about when they expect the talk to end. You better know what that expectation is. And if you miss that expectation, they will stop absorbing stuff, or they'll absorb it very, very much less well. So it's ineffective to carry on. So simply truncate. You have to find yourself ways. Just if you're not at the end, you just have to say, it's tough. Have a summary slide that summarizes, say the details are in the paper. But what you cannot do is just go on. In conference settings, you will not be allowed to go on. In other settings, it's simply impolite and ineffective too. So it's a very important rule. Fortunately, today we're in good shape because we're in plenty of time. Because this is in fact my last slide. Right? I just want to be encouraging about this, since you can start doing this now as you go to talks. You can mark them out of 10 along some of these criteria and think, I could do better than that. Giving talk, right? The content, really cool, interesting technical content, clever idea, but presentation, it wasn't much fun. It didn't make me feel like I'd like to come back. What would I have done if I was presenting this to do it differently? You can be kind of reflective, not only about your own talks or your own papers, but about other people's talks and papers. Any other observations or questions or suggestions? Yes?
Can you take the mic around?
Oh, yes, right.
Gets recorded.
Excellent, my friend.
So the slide where you're talking about, just highlighting one bullet point at a time. Supposing it was not bullet, supposing you want to talk about the 7 steps of your approach or something, and you want to walk the audience through the steps as you speak, like wouldn't you want to use the slides to support your talk rather than showing the thing and then you supporting the slides? And
Maybe.
I don't know.
Yeah, so I think if you are thoughtful about it, right, if you have a specific purpose to revealing things one at a time, go right ahead. It's just that as a default, for every slide in every list, it's not a good plan, I think. So none of these are cast iron rules. So you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Do you have a golden way of preparing actually for your presentation? So
you mean how do I prepare for a talk?
Yeah, for example, prepare exercise in front of your colleagues, days before, a week before, whatsoever. What's your golden way to do that?
Do you mean by preparing the content, like the slides?
Yeah, exactly.
You don't mean going for a run before?
Preparing the talk.
Oh, okay. So, what do I do? So usually it is a few days before, and usually I try not to start preparing the talk itself too long in advance. If it's a month in advance, you can spend a whole month obsessing about the slides. It sort of absorbs an almost infinite amount of time. Right? Because it's a task that has no completion moment until the talk itself. So, again, this depends a bit about how often you've given a talk like this before. But typically I would start preparing a talk whose content I was reasonably confident I knew was sound, like when I had a paper. So I knew that the content was okay. It was just a question of presenting it. I might start a couple of days before, 3 or 4 days before. And usually I sort of just sit down for a morning and start to write slides, kind of in the spirit of, I'm just trying to explain this to somebody. Then I might try to find a colleague and just sort of walk them through and see. It's hard to get colleagues who will really be critical. They'll mostly just say, that seemed great. Right? So if you can really train them to be critical, that can be helpful. Occasionally people give practice talks to a small audience, but I think that's most helpful just for building your confidence and also the confidence about the time scale. How long will it take to present this? Because that can be something that's a bit difficult to be sure about in advance. But you don't need an audience for that part. You could just, present it in an empty room, just to be sure that the amount of material you have will fit in the time slot that you've got. Yeah. But not too long in advance.
In some presentation courses you do, you're often encouraged to kind of video yourself and look at yourself, etc. Do you encourage that? Or?
Actually, I think that can be quite interesting. Yes, it's a bit scary actually, but I think if you can get somebody to video you, just while you're giving a live talk with a live audience, that can be quite. Yes, you sometimes you said, did I really do that? Yes.
I just want to add to what the previous guy said. There was a really good tip that I received we had a course in Cambridge for research skills. And one of the tips was to first write down what you're going to say. It doesn't have to be the actual lyrics, but before opening PowerPoint or whatever, just write it down. And I actually tried it afterwards for a talk I gave, and it was really, really useful because a lot of times your ideas are messed up because you're trying to work on the presentation. So first have like a really clear view of what you're going to say. I actually wrote it down, and then it gives you ideas on how to visualize that. So I found that really, really
so a kind
helpful.
of just a written outline for the talk, a sequence of ideas.
You can go even more deeper than that, but just before opening any presentation.
No, it's a really good idea.
It was helpful for me.
Yes. This guy at the end here. Just throw it.
So I haven't been to like many conferences, but I've been to a few, and in that sample I would say that in academic talks, something like 90% of the talks I saw, I would say, were pretty bad. Probably about 5% more were very bad, and then maybe 5% were okay. So I wondered, as somebody, because I really enjoyed this talk, and I thought everything you said made a lot of sense, and you've obviously done this quite a lot, and I wondered, like, despite such great advice, why isn't this working? Like, why is academia?
Every year, another 50 research students go out and give fantastic talks.
Okay, it's a tip of the iceberg, but we all go to conferences and listen to an incredible amount of really terrible, boring talks, and that's a shame, isn't it? It's a real shame. So how can this change?
Just follow some simple suggestions. I don't know how to change for the world. I don't know, but just change it for yourself. That would be a good example. But I think probably the dominant thing that makes academic talks not so good is the feeling of that you've got to ram too much material into it, right? And rather than convey the intuition, the feeling this is a sophisticated, highly technical audience and we have to impress them. Don't think that. Just to convey the idea, simple idea. There was a question here as well.
Yeah, sorry, I just...
but it's a long way back. Just shout for now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just a few scattered observations. So,
but shout loudly so everyone can hear you.
Louder,
yeah.
Sure. So one rule of thumb that I use, I don't know how good it is in general, but is I kind of say 1 minute per slide. So if I limit kind of the material I give by just literally the number of slides I'm allotting myself, which I found kind of a very useful way of doing it. And another thing is for kind of, I don't know, I mean, it's small, but it might help. Like when I get that little freak out moment before I start talking, I usually have a little bottle of water. I just one drink of water. Somehow, to me at least, it sounds really stupid, but it really kind of helps me.
Small displacement activity.
Exactly,
yes.
something small to kind of distract you. And one last thing is about the eye contact is. I agree that you need to look at specific people in the audience, but one thing I would be careful about, and it might happen, is looking at one person too much.
Right,
so
yeah.
That would be a little creepy for them, so you don't want to...
Yeah.
So even if they're nodding...
They can get a sort of persecution complex, can't they? Yeah, see, and the others will feel sort of shortchanged as well if you never look at them. You know.
So make sure you have a few of them spaced out.
Yeah, you need sort of strategically placed. Yes. Thank you. Good. Guy in the check shirt, yeah.
So how do you think how close should be the contents of the talk, so what you say and the contents of the slides? Because some people say that they expect it to be pretty close, but then there are lots of examples of great talks where like the contents, what the speaker says, and the slide are connected very loosely. So what's your opinion on that?
So generally, I think it's a mistake to just read what's on the slide. Well, so that's a very tight coupling, right? That's an extreme.
I'm not about reading. I'm just kind of, for example, saying, speaking out what is in the slides, not omitting any point from the slides, for example.
Yeah, so typically, so more or less, if you're going to put something on the slide, you probably put it there because you want to say something about it. Otherwise, why did you put it there? So I said earlier, under pressure of time, you might leave some things out. But typically, you don't want to put something on the slide that is irrelevant to the talk. But just don't read it. That's very important. It's very dull if somebody literally reads their slides. Particularly since in order to read them, they usually put their back to the audience, and that's not very engaging either.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah. So how do you deal with trivial or silly questions like this one? Or or even with like non-questions. I don't know. Someone says something in a tone of a question. I expect you to say something, and what do you do?
Well, so my default reaction is to try to find value in it. Right? Somebody, in other words, assume that they are engaging with you and with your talk, and that it wasn't really a trivial. They were actually trying to say something. So I might ask a clarifying question if it appeared to be trivial. So it's that sounds straightforward. The answer is this, but you probably meant something deeper than that. Kind of said in a positive way. It's very seldom that you get people really trying to disrupt your talk by just making random comments, I think. And if you do, then we have to go back to what we were saying earlier, and you just shut them down. But it's not a big problem usually, in my experience. Whereas a much bigger problem usually is lack of engagement with the audience. So, the needle's over here. I just want to drag it a bit back here. And of course, if you go,
No, once it happened to me, right? So I was given a talk in a conference, and they just asked something with no answer. Basically, it just
well, then you have to say, I'm sorry, I can't answer that. I can't connect it with my dog. I better carry on. You just got to look at you. Get help from your chair if you need it. Bad things can happen. Sometimes things go wrong.
Right, thank you very much.
That's not the norm.
I think we'll wrap up here.
Yes, good.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Simon.